We had 16 young people who took part in our project, and they were incredibly insightful about their learning and about what was working and not working for them. And in terms of how they best were learning, they really emphasized that the space itself was critical. So having a safe space in which to learn, one in which there were fewer sensory demands and distractions, and also fewer social expectations. So at school, often a very noisy classroom, and there are also multiple, often unpredictable interactions with peers and teachers and other adults that autistic children and young people have to manage. And at home, all of those sensory demands and social demands were reduced, which made it easier for them to learn. The other thing that they highlighted was time. So young people talked about how they felt less stressed during lockdown because they could essentially learn at their own pace and use the time more flexibly. When we found it particularly interesting because it really goes against lots of stereotypes about autism and how autistic people need structure and routine. Of course they do, and we all do. But what was clear from our findings is that young people like some structure, but they had more freedom during remote learning to create that structure for themselves and to also ensure that they had downtime, during their schooling week. So time to kind of just chill out and decompress. So those were the two biggest things I think that young people themselves spoke about, this, having a safe space that was conducive to learning, but also to have a kind of really flexible schedule, essentially, one that in part could be controlled by themselves.
And I think part of that was it was a responsive schedule. So they could respond to the context of their day. If they felt stressed that day, if they hadn't slept well, if there were any other kind of contextual things that were happening in their lives that day, because it was a self-prescribed routine, they could adapt to their context. In schools, one of the things that is really challenging for so many autistic children are the continuous transitions, and particularly for young people who are at high school who are transitioning at every 60 or 70 minutes between subjects. One of our young people talked about being able to just do all of his maths on one day and just not having to transition out of that headspace. As long as it was done by Friday, nobody cared when he did it. There's real insight in that into the way minimizing those micro transitions, which happen so often through a day, actually really benefited our kids. There was a great deal of trust and connection between parents and their young people, which also really supported their learning as well, and speaks to the importance of that trust and connection between teacher and learner in schooling environments as well. It's interesting that even though very often the curriculum was less differentiated because, of course, teachers were understandably just trying to translate curriculum into an online learning environment. So a great deal of differentiation of the curriculum was lost in that translation. So in fact, they lost some flexibility in what they were learning. The ability to prescribe and be flexible and responsive to your own needs, that increase in flexibility then provided a great deal of comfort. There were some lovely examples of people talking about just being able just to sit with their cat, have a nap with their cat, to reset when they needed to, rather than in a prescribed break that was sort of externally prescribed at a particular time. They were able to self-identify when that needed to happen and could take on that sort of flexible approach to their own learning and the autonomy over how and when they learned, which was hugely beneficial.
And there's a lovely quote that illustrates that from one young person that says something like, I'm more inclined to trust myself and to trust that I know what I'm doing, which is lovely to hear.